Hi there. I'm reading Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig, Chapter 3. 1966, my God, how the years had sped up. He wondered what Dusenberry'd be like now, if he'd lived. Not much, maybe. There were signs before he died that he was going downhill, that he'd been at the peak of his powers about the time that Feeders knew him in Bozeman, Montana, where they were both members of the English department. Dusenberry was born in Bozeman and had graduated from college there, but after 23 years on the faculty, his assignment was just 3 sections of freshman composition. No literature courses, no advanced composition courses of any kind. Academically, he had long before been placed in the tough pile of scholars, whom the department would just as soon gotten rid of. Tenure was all that saved him from the junk pile. He had little to do with the rest of the department socially. Other members seemed to be in various degrees of alienation from him. This seemed odd to Feeders, because in his own conversations with him, Dusenberry was not at all unsociable. He sometimes looked unsociable, with his arched eyebrow and downturned mouth. But when Feeders had gotten to know him, Dusenberry was actually gabby in a high-spirited, gleeful, maiden-auntish sort of way. It was a slightly gay style, tart and somewhat backbiting. And at first, Feeders thought this is why they were so down on him. Montanans in those days were supposed to look and act like Marlboro ads, but in time Feeders saw that wasn't what caused the alienation. It was just Dusenberry's general overall eccentricity. Over the years, small eccentric differences in a small college department can grow into big differences, and Dusenberry's differences were not so small. The biggest difference was revealed in a line Feeders heard a number of times, a disdainful, "Oh yes, Dusenberry and his Indians." Equal disdain, "Oh yes, the English department." But he seldom spoke of them at all. The only subject he spoke about with any sincere enthusiasm was Indians, and particularly the Rocky Boy Indians, the Chippewa Cree on the Canadian border, about whom he was writing his Ph.D. thesis in anthropology. He let it be known that except for the Indians he had befriended for 21 of his 23 years as a teacher, he regarded all those years as a waste of his life. He was an advisor for all the Indian students at the college, and had held this post for as long as anyone could remember. The students were a connecting link. He'd made a point to know their families and visit them, and use this as an entry point into their lives. He spent all the weekend and vacation time he could on the reservations, participating in their ceremonies, running errands for them, driving their kids to the hospital when they were sick, speaking to state officials when they got in trouble, and beyond that, completely losing himself into the ways and personalities and secrets and mysteries of those people he loved 100 times better than his own. Within a few years, when his degree was completed, he would be leaving English teaching forever and teaching anthropology instead. One would guess that this would be a happy solution for him. But from what Feeders heard, it was already apparent that it would not be. He was not only an eccentric in the field of English, he was an eccentric in anthropology as well. The main part of his eccentricity seemed to be his refusal to accept objectivity as an anthropological criterion. He didn't think objectivity had any place in the proper conduct of anthropological study. This was like saying the Pope has no place in the Catholic Church. In American anthropology, that is the worst possible apostasy, and Dusenberry was quickly informed of it. Of all the American universities he had applied to for his PhD study, every one had turned him down. But rather than change his beliefs, he had gone around the whole American university system to Professor Åke Hultkrantz in Uppsala, Sweden's oldest university, and was about to receive his Ph.D. there. Whenever Dusenberry talked about this, a cat who ate the canary smile would come over his face. An American taking a Ph.D. in Sweden on the anthropology of American Indians? It was ludicrous. The trouble with the objective approach, Dusenberry said, is that you don't learn much that way. The only way to find out about Indians is to care for them and win their love and respect. Then they'll do almost anything for you. But if you don't do that, he would shake his head and his thoughts would go trailing off. I've seen these objective workers come on the reservations, he said, and get absolutely nowhere. There's a pseudoscience myth that when you're objective, you just disappear from the face of the earth and see everything undistorted as it really is, like God from heaven. But that's rubbish. When a person's objective, his attitude is remote. He gets a sort of stony, distant look on his face. The Indians see that. They see it better than we do. And when they see it, they don't like it. They don't know where in the hell these objective anthros are at, and it makes them suspicious. So they clam up, and they don't say anything. Or they'll just tell them nonsense, which, of course, a lot of the anthros believe at first, because they got it objectively, and the Indians sometimes laugh at them behind their backs. Some of these anthropologists make big names for themselves in their departments, Dusenberry said, because they know all that jargon. But they really don't know as much as they think they do, and they especially don't like people who tell them so, which I do, he laughed. So that's why I'm not objective about the Indians, he said. I believe in them, and they believe in me, and that makes all the difference. They've told me things they've said they've never told any other white man because they know I'll never use it against them. It's a whole different way of relating to them. Indians first, anthropology second. That limits me in a lot of ways. There's so much I can't say, but it's better to know a lot and say little, I think, than to know little and say a lot. Don't you agree? Because Phaedrus was new to the English department, Dusenberry took a curious interest in him. Dusenberry was curious about everything. And as he got to know Phaedrus better, the curiosity grew. Here, to Dusenberry's surprise, was someone who seemed even more alienated than he was, someone who had done graduate work in Hindu philosophy at Benares, India, for God's sake, and knew something about cultural differences. More important, Phaedrus seemed to have a very analytic mind. That's what I don't have, Dusenberry had said. I know volumes about these people, but I can't structure it. I just don't have that kind of mind. So every chance he got, he poured hours and hours of information about American Indians into Phaedrus's ears, hoping to get back from him some overall structure, some picture of what it meant in larger terms. Phaedrus listened, but he never had any answers. Dusenberry was particularly concerned about Indian religion. He was sure it explained why the Indians were so slow in integrating into the surrounding white culture. He noticed that tribes with the strongest religious practices were the most backward by white standards, and he wanted Phaedrus to provide some theoretical support for this. Phaedrus thought Dusenberry was probably right, but couldn't think of any theoretical support, and thought the whole thesis was somewhat dull and academic. For more than a year, Dusenberry never tried to correct to this impression. He just kept on feeding information about the Indians to Phaedrus and getting back Phaedrus's lack of ideas. But then, a few months before Phaedrus was to leave Bozeman for another teaching job, Dusenberry said to him, "There's something I think I have to show you." "Where?" Phaedrus asked. "On the Northern Cheyenne Reservation down Busby. Have you been there?" "No," Phaedrus said. "Well, it's a wretched place, but I've promised to take some students down, and you should come along too. I want you to see a meeting of the Native American Church. The students won't be going to it, but you should." "You're going to convert me?" Phaedrus said facetiously. "Maybe," Dusenberry said. Dusenberry explained that they would be sitting in a teepee all night long until sunup. After midnight, Phaedrus could leave if he wanted, but before that no one was permitted to leave. "What do we do all night?" Phaedrus asked. "In the center of the teepee there will be a fire, and there will be ceremonies connected to it, and a lot of singing and drumming. Not much talking. After the meeting is over in the morning, there'll be a ceremonial meal." Phaedrus thought about it and then agreed and asked what the meal was like. Dusenberry smiled with a kind of arch smile. He said, "One time they were supposed to have the food, from before the white men came, blueberries and venison and all that. And so what did they do? They broke out 3 cans of Del Monte corn and started opening all the cans with a can opener. I stood it as long as I could, and finally I told them, 'No, no, no, not canned corn.' And they laughed at me. They said, just like a white man, has to have everything just right." Then after that, all night long, they did everything the way I said, and they thought that was an even bigger joke, because now they weren't only using white man's corn, they were having a white man run the ceremony. And they were all laughing at me. They're always doing stuff like that. We just love each other. I just have the best time when I'm down there. "What's the purpose of staying up all night?" Phaedrus asked. Dusenberry looked at him meaningfully. "Visions," he said. "From the fire?" "There's a sacramental food that you take that induces them. It's called peyote." That was the first time Phaedrus had ever heard the name. That was just before Leary and Albert's notoriety, and the great age of hippies, trippers, and flower children that peyote and its synthetic equivalent LSD helped to produce. Peyote back then was all but unknown to almost anyone except anthropologists and other specialists in Indian affairs. In the tray of slips, just back of the ones on Dusenberry, was a section of slips on how the Indians had quietly brought peyote up from Mexico in the late 19th century, eating it to induce an altered mental state that they considered a form of religious communion. Dusenberry had indicated that the Indians who used it regarded it as a quicker and surer way of arriving at the condition reached in the traditional vision quest, where an Indian goes out into isolation and fasts and prays and meditates for days in the darkness of a sealed lodge until the Great Spirit reveals itself to him and takes over his life. On one of his slips, Phaedrus had copied a reference that showed the similarity of the peyote experience to the old vision quest descriptions. According to the description, it produces lightheadedness, a state of well-being, and increased attention to all perceptions, sensations, and inner mental events. Perceptual modifications follow, initially, manifested by vivid and spontaneous visual imagery, which evolves to illusions and finally to visual hallucinations. Emotions are intensified, vary widely in context, and may include euphoria, apathy, serenity, or anxiety. The intellect is drawn into the analysis of complex realities or transcendental questions. Consciousness expands to include all these responses simultaneously. In later stages, following a large dose of a hallucinogen, a person may experience a feeling of union with nature, associated with the dissolution of personal identity, engendering a state of beatitude or even ecstasy. A dissociative reaction in which the subject loses contact with immediate reality may also occur. A subject may experience abandonment of the body, may see elaborate visions, or feel the imminence of death, which could lead to terror and panic. The experience is determined by the person's mental state, the structure of his or her personality, the physical setting, and cultural influences. The source Phaedrus had taken this material from concluded that current research and discussion are clouded by political and social issues, which since the 1960s has certainly been true. One slip noted that Dusenberry had been asked to testify before the Montana legislature on the matter. The president of the college told him not to say anything, presumably to avoid political repercussions. Dusenberry complied and told Phaedrus later how guilty he felt about this. After the 60s, the whole issue of peyote became one of those no-win political contests between individual freedom on the one hand and democracy on the other. Clearly, LSD was injuring some innocent people with hallucinations that led to their death, and clearly the majority of Americans wanted drugs such as LSD made illegal. But the majority of Americans were not Indians, and certainly they were not members of the Native American Church. There was a persecution of a religious minority going on here, something that's not supposed to happen in America. The majority opposition to peyote reflected cultural bias, the belief unsupported by scientific or historical evidence that hallucinatory experience is automatically bad. Since hallucinations are a form of insanity, the term hallucinogen is clearly pejorative. Like early descriptions of Buddhism as a heathen religion and Islam as barbaric, it begs some metaphysical questions. The Indians who use it as part of their ceremony might with equal accuracy call it a dehallucinogen, since it's their claim that it removes the hallucinations of contemporary life and reveals the reality buried beneath them. There's actually some scientific support for this Indian point of view. Experiments have shown that spiders fed LSD do not wander around doing purposeless things as one might expect a hallucination would cause them to do, but instead spin an abnormally perfect symmetrical web. That would support the dehallucinogen thesis, but politics seldom depends on facts for its decisions. Behind the index card for the peyote slips was another card called reservation. There were more than 100 reservation slips describing that ceremony Dusenberry and Phaedrus attended. Way too many. Most would have to be junked. He made them because at one time it looked as though the whole book would center around this long night's meeting of the Native American Church. The ceremony would be a kind of spine to hold it all together. From it he would branch out and show in tangent after tangent the analysis of complex realities and transcendental questions that first emerged in his mind there. The place can be seen from US 212 about 200 miles from the highway, but all you see from the road is tar-papered shacks and grungy dogs and maybe a poorly dressed Indian walking on the earth footpath past some junked cars, as if to make a point of the shabbiness. A clean white steeple of a missionary church stands in the middle of all this. Away from the steeple, off by itself, and probably gone by now, was a large teepee that looked like it might have been put up as a tourist attraction, except that there was no way you could drive to it from the road, and there were no billboards or signs around advertising anything for sale. The physical distance to that teepee from the highway was about 200 yards, but culturally the distance bridged with Dusenberry that night was more like thousands of years. Friedrich couldn't have gone that distance without the peyote. He would have had to just sit there observing all of this objectively, like a well-trained anthropology student. But the peyote prevented that. He didn't observe, he participated, exactly as Dusenberry had intended he should do. From twilight, when the peyote buttons were passed around, until midnight, he sat staring across the flames of the ceremonial fire. The ring of Indian faces around the edge of the teepee had seemed ominous at first. In the alternating light and shadow from the fire, the faces seemed misshapen, with sinister expressions, like the storybook Indians of old. Then that expression passed, and they seemed merely inscrutable. After that, there was a scaling down of thoughts that occurs whenever you adjust to a new physical situation. What am I doing here, he wondered. I wonder how things are doing now back home. How am I going to get those English papers corrected by Monday, and so on? But the thoughts gradually became less and less demanding, and he settled down more and more into where he was and what he was watching. Sometime after midnight, after he had listened to the singing and beating on the drum for hours and hours, something began to change. The exotic aspects began to fade. Instead of being an onlooker, feeling greater and greater distance from all this, his perceptions began to go in the opposite direction. He began to feel a warmth toward the songs. He murmured to John Woodenleg, the Indian sitting next to him, "John, that's a great song." And he meant it. John looked at him with surprise. Some huge, unexpected change was taking place in his attitude towards this music and toward the people who were singing it. Something in the way they spoke and handled things and related to each other struck a resonance too, way deep inside him, at levels that had seldom resonated favorably to anything. He couldn't figure out what it was. Was the peyote just making him sentimental? He didn't think so. It ran deeper than sentimentality. Sentimentality is a narrowing of experience to the emotionally familiar, but this was something new opening up. There was a contradiction here. It was something new opening up that gave the sentimental feeling one might get from his childhood home, when he sees a tree he once climbed on, or a swing he used to play on, a feeling of coming home to some place one had never been before. Why should he feel at home? This was the last place on earth where he should feel that. He really didn't. Only part of him felt at home. The other part still felt estranged and analytic and watchful. It seemed as though he was splitting into two people, one of whom wanted to stay there forever and the other wanted to leave immediately. The latter one, he understood. But who was this first person? This first person was a mystery. The first person seemed like it must be some secret side of his personality, a dark side, that seldom spoke and didn't show itself to other people. He guessed he knew about it. He just didn't like to think about it. It was the side with the sullen, scowling outlook, a side that didn't like authority, had never amounted to anything, and never would, and he knew that, and was sad about it. But he couldn't help it. It could never be happy anywhere, and always wanted to move on. This wild side was saying for the first time, "Stop wandering," and "These are your real people." And that was what he began to see there, listening to the songs and the drums and staring into the fire. Something about these people seemed to say to this bad side of himself, "We know exactly how you feel. We feel this way ourselves." The other side, the good, analytic side, just watched, and before long it slowly began to spin an enormous, symmetrical, intellectual web, larger and more perfect than any it had ever spun before. The nucleus of this intellectual web was the observation that when the Indians entered the teepee or went out or added logs or passed the ceremonial peyote or pipe or food, they just did these things. They didn't go about doing them. They just did them. There was no waste motion. When they moved a branch into the fire to build it up, they just moved it. There was no sense of ceremony. They were engaged in a ceremony, but the way they did it, there wasn't any ceremony. Normally he wouldn't have attached much importance to this, but now, with the peyote opening up his mind and with his attention having nowhere else to go, he bored in on it with intensity. This directness and simplicity was in the way they spoke, too. They spoke the way they moved, without any ceremony. It seemed to always come from deep within them. They just said what they wanted to say, then they stopped. It wasn't just the way they pronounced words. It was their attitude. Plain spoken, he thought. Plains spoken. They were speaking in the language of the plains. This was the pure Plains American dialect he was listening to. It wasn't just Indian. It was white, too. It was a kind of Midwestern and Western accent you hear in Woody Guthrie songs and cowboy movies. When Henry Fonda appears in The Grapes of Wrath, or Gary Cooper, or John Wayne, or Gene Autry, or Roy Rogers, or William S. Boyd appear in any of 100 different Westerns, this is how they talk. Not like some fancy college professor, but plains spoken, laconic, understated. Very little tonal change, no change of expression. Yet there was a warmth between the surface you couldn't point to the source of. Films have made the whole world know the dialect so well it's almost a cliché. But the way these Indians were speaking, it wasn't any cliché. They were speaking the American Western dialect just as authentically as any cowboy had ever heard. More authentically. It wasn't something they were putting on. It was them. The web expanded when Phaedrus began to consider the fact that English wasn't even the native language of those people. They didn't speak English in their homes. How was it that these linguistic foreigners spoke the Plains dialect of American English not only as well as their white neighbors, but actually better? How could they possibly imitate it so perfectly when it was obvious from their lack of ceremony that they weren't trying to imitate anything at all? The web grew wider and wider. They were not imitating. If there's one thing these people didn't do, it was imitate. Everything was coming straight from the heart. That seemed to be the whole idea. To get things down to a point where everything's coming straight on, direct, no imitation. But if they weren't imitating, why did they talk this way? Why were they imitating? Then the huge peyote illumination came. They're the originators. It expanded until he felt as though he had walked through the screen of a movie and for the first time watched the people who were projecting it from the other side. Most of the rest of the whole tray of slips, many more than 1,000 of them before him here, was a direct growth from that one original insight. Tucked in among them was a copy of his speech made at the Medicine Lodge Council of 1867 by 10 Bears, a Comanche chief. Phaedrus had copied it from a book on Indian oratory to use as an example of the plain speech by someone who could not possibly have learned it from the whites. Now he read it again. 10 Bears spoke to the assembled tribes, and specifically to the representatives of Washington, saying, "There are things which you have said to me which I do not like. They were not sweet like sugar, but bitter like gourds. You said you wanted to put us on a reservation, to build us houses and to make us medicine lodges. I do not want them. I was born on the prairie, where the wind blew free, and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures, and where everything drew a free breath. I want to die there, and not within walls. I know every stream and every wood between the Rio Grande and the Arkansas. I have hunted and lived over in that country. I lived like my fathers before me, and like them I lived happily. When I was at Washington, the Great Father told me that all the Comanche land was ours, and that no one should hinder us living upon it. So why do you ask us to leave the rivers and the sun and the wind and live in houses? Do not ask us to give up the buffalo for the sheep. The young men have heard talk of this, and it has made them sad and angry. Do not speak of it any more. I love to carry out the talk I get from the Great Father. When I get goods and presents, I and my people feel glad, since it shows that he holds us in his eye. If the Texans had kept out of my country, there might have been peace. But that which you now say we must live on is too small. The Texans have taken away the places where the grass grew the thickest and the timber was the best. Had we kept that, we might have done this thing you ask, but it is too late. The white man has the country which we loved, and we only wish to wander on the prairie until we die. Any good thing you say to me shall not be forgotten. I shall carry it near to my heart as my children, and it shall be as often on my tongue as the name of the Great Spirit. I want no blood on my land to stain the grass. I want it all clear and pure, and I wish it so, that all who go through among my people may find peace when they come in, and leave it when they go out. As Feeders read it again this time, he saw that it wasn't quite as close to the cowboy speech he'd remembered. It was a damn sight better than cowboy speech, but it was still closer to the White Plains dialect than is the language of the European. Here were the straight, head-on, declarative sentences without stylistic ornamentation of any kind, but with a poetic force that must have put the sophisticated bureaucratic speech of Tin Bear's antagonist to shame. This was no imitation of the involuted Victorian elocution of 1867. From that original perception of the Indians as the originators of the American style of speech had come an expansion. The Indians were the originators of the American style of life. The American personality is a mixture of European and Indian values. When you see this, you begin to see a lot of things that have never been explained before. Feeders' problem now was to organize all this into a persuasive book. It was so radically different from the usual explanations of America, people would never believe it. They'd think he was just babbling. If he talked in generalities, he knew he would lose it. People would just say, oh yes, well, that's just another one of those interesting ideas people are always coming up with, or you can't generalize about Indians because they're all different, or some other cliche like that, and he'd walk away from it. He thought for a while he might come at it obliquely, starting with something very concrete and specific, such as a cowboy film that people already knew about, for example, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There is an opening scene in that film where everything is shown in brown monochrome, probably to give a historic legendary feeling to it. The Sundance Kid is playing poker, and the scene is slowed down a little to give it dramatic tension. The kid's face is all you see. Only a fragment of one of the other players is sometimes seen, and an occasional wisp of smoke passing before the Sundance Kid's countenance. The kid is without expression, but is alert and self-controlled. The voice of an unseen gambler says, well, it looks like you cleaned everybody out, fella. You haven't lost a hand since you got the deal. There's no change in the kid's expression. What's the secret of your success? The gambler's voice continues. It is threatening, ominous. Sundance looks down for a while, as if thinking about it, and then looks up unemotionally. Prayer, he says. He doesn't mean it, but he doesn't say it sarcastically either. It's a statement poised on a knife edge of ambiguity. Let's just you and me play, the gambler says. A showdown is about to occur. It is the cliché of the Wild West. It has been repeated in hundreds of films and in thousands of theaters and millions of TV sets again and again. The tension grows, but the Sundance Kid's expression doesn't change. His eye movements, his pauses, are in a kind of relaxed harmony between himself and his surroundings, even though we see he is in a growingly dangerous situation, which soon explodes into violence. What Feeders wanted to do now was just use that one scene as an opening illustration. To it he would add just one explanation, which no one ever notices, but which he was sure was true. What you have seen, he would explain, is a rendition of the cultural style of an American Indian. Then would be seen identified for what they were, the famous old traits of the American Indian: silence, a modesty of manner, and a dangerous willingness to sudden, enormous violence. It would be a dramatic way of making a point, he thought. Before you are alerted to it, you don't see it, but once you become aware, it's obvious. The source of values that Robert Redford tapped, and that the American public overwhelmingly responded to, is the cultural value pattern of the American Indian. Even the color of Redford's face in the sepia monochrome was changed to that of an Indian. Certainly, it wasn't the intention of the film to personify an Indian. It came naturally, as a way of showing the Wild West. But the point of Friedrich's thesis was that the reason it came naturally, and the audiences responded to it naturally, was that the film reached into a root source of American feelings for what is good. It is this source of what is good, this historic cultural system of American values, which is Indian. If you take a list of all the things European observers have stated to be the characteristics of white Americans, you will find that there is a correlation with the characteristics white American observers have customarily assigned to the Indians. And furthermore, if you take another list of all the characteristics that Americans use to describe Europeans, you'll get a pretty good correlation with Indian opinions of white Americans. To prove the point, Friedrich intended to reverse the situation. Instead of showing how a cowboy resembles an Indian, he would show how an Indian resembles a cowboy. For this, he found a description by the anthropologist E.A. Hobel of a Cheyenne Indian male. Reserved and dignified, the Cheyenne male moves with a quiet sense of self-assurance. He speaks fluently but never carelessly. He is careful of the sensibilities of others and is kindly and generous. He is slow to anger and strives to suppress his feelings, if aggravated. Vigorous on the hunt, in war he prizes the active life. Towards enemies he feels no merciful compunctions, and the more aggressive he is, the better. He is well versed in ritual knowledge. He is neither flighty nor dour, usually quiet. He has a lightly displayed sense of humor. He is sexually repressed and masochistic, but that masochism is expressed in culturally approved rites. He does not show much creative imagination and artistic expression, but he has a firm grip on reality. He deals with the problems of life in set ways, while at the same time showing a notable capacity to readjust to new circumstances. His thinking is rationalistic to a high degree, yet colored with mysticism. His ego is strong and not easily threatened. His superego, as manifest in the strong social conscience and mastery of his basic impulses, is powerful and dominating. He is mature, serene, and composed, secure in his social position, capable of warm social relations. He has powerful anxieties, but these are channeled into institutionalized mode of collective expression with satisfactory results. He exhibits few neurotic tendencies. Now, if that isn't a description of William S. Boyd playing Hopalong Cassidy in 23 or 50 or however many films, there never was one. With the single exception of the Indian mysticism, the characterization is perfect. Whether the American cowboy ever really was like William S. Boyd is not really relevant. What is relevant is that in the 1930s, during the darkest days of the Great Depression, Americans shoveled out millions of dollars to look at his movies. They didn't have to. No one forced them to, but they went anyway, just as they later went to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They did so because those movies were a confirmation of the values they believed in. Those movies were rituals, almost religious rituals. For transmitting the cultural values of America wasn't a deliberate, conscious process. People were just doing what they liked. It is only when one analyzes what they liked that one sees the assimilation of Indian values. Others of the thousands of slips in Friedrich's trays continued this analysis. Many Europeans think of white Americans as sloppy, untidy people, but they're not nearly as untidy as the Indians on the reservations. Europeans often think of white Americans as being too direct and plain-spoken, bad-mannered, and sort of insolent the way they do things. But Indians are even more that way. In World War II, Europeans noted that American troops drank too much, and when they got drunk, they made a lot of trouble. The comparison with Indians is obvious, but on the other hand, European military commanders rated the stability of American troops under fire as high, and that is also an Indian characteristic. That steady, when you say that, smile look the cowboy movies love to portray, and Europeans tend to abhor, is pure Indian, except that when the Indian looks that way, it doesn't necessarily mean he is threatening. What causes that steady look comes from something much deeper. Indians don't talk to fill time. When they don't have anything to say, they don't say it. When they don't say it, they leave the impression of being a little ominous. In the presence of this Indian silence, whites sometimes get nervous and feel forced as a matter of politeness or kindness to fill the vacuum with a kind of small talk, which often says one thing and means another. But these well-mannered circumlocutions of aristocratic European speech are forked-tongued talk to the Indian and are infuriating. They violate his morality. He wants you to either speak from the heart or keep quiet. This has been a source of Indian-white conflict for centuries, and although the modern white American personality is a compromise of that conflict, the conflict still exists. To this day, Americans are mistakenly characterized by Europeans as like children, naive, immature, and tending towards violence because they don't know how to control themselves. That mistake is also made about the Indians. To this day, white Americans are also mistakenly characterized by Indians as a bunch of snobs who think you are so stupid you can never see how phony you are. That mistake is also made about the Europeans. This anti-snobbery of all Americans, particularly Western Americans, is derived from this Indian attitude. The Cheyenne name for white man is Wihio, meaning spider. Arapaho uses Nyatha to mean the same thing. To the Indian, whites seemed like spiders when they talked. They sat there and they smiled and said things they didn't mean, and all the time their mind was spinning a web around the Indian. They got so lost in their own web-spinning thoughts, they didn't even see that the Indian was watching them too, and could see what they were doing. The American politics of isolationism, and its refusal to become entangled in the meshes of European politics, comes from this root feeder's thought. Most of American isolationism has come from regions that are closest to the American Indian. The slips went on detailing European and Indian cultural differences and their effects, and as the slips had grown in number, a secondary corollary thesis had emerged, that this process of diffusion and assimilation of Indian values is not over. It's still with us and accounts for much of the restlessness and dissatisfaction found in America today. Within each American, these conflicting sets of values still clash. This clash, Feeder's thought, explained why others hadn't seen long before what he had seen at the peyote meeting. When you borrow traits and attitudes from a hostile culture, you don't give them credit for it. You tell a white from Alabama that his Southern accent is derived from a Negro speech, he is likely to deny and resent it, although the geographical congruity of the Southern accent with huge areas of black population makes this pretty obvious. Similarly, if you tell a Montana white living near a reservation that he resembles an Indian, he may take it as an insult, and if you had said that 100 years ago, you might have had a real fight on your hands. The Indians were fiends from hell. The only good one was a dead one. But even though Indians were never given proper credit for their contribution to the American frontier personality values, it's certain that these values couldn't have come from anywhere else. One often hears frontier values spoken of as though they had come from the rocks, the rivers, and the trees of the frontier. But trees, rocks, and rivers do not, by themselves, confer social values. They've got trees, rocks, and rivers in Europe. It was the people living among those trees, rocks, and rivers who were the source of the values of the frontier. The early frontiersmen, such as the mountain men, deliberately and enthusiastically imitated the Indians. They were delighted to be told that they were indistinguishable from the Indians. Settlers who came later copied the mountain men's frontier style, but didn't see its source, or if they did, denied it, and credited it to their own hard work and isolation. But the clash between European and Indian values still exists, and Phaedrus felt he himself was one of those in whom the battle was taking place. That is why he had this feeling of coming home at the peyote meeting. The division he'd felt within himself and thought was something wrong with himself was not within himself at all. What he was seeing was the source of himself, and that had never been formally acknowledged. It was a division within the entire American culture that he had projected upon himself. It was in many others too. In one of his long contemplations of this subject, the name of Mark Twain appeared. Twain was from Hannibal, Missouri, along the Mississippi, the great dividing line between the American East and West. And one of his most fearsome villains was Injun Joe, who personified the Indian the settlers feared at the time. But Twain's biographers had also noted a deep division in his own personality that shaped his choice of heroes. On the one side was an orderly, intelligent, obedient, clean, and relatively responsible young lad who he fictionalized as Tom Sawyer, and on the other a wild, freedom-loving, uneducated, lying, irresponsible, low-status American he called Huckleberry Finn. Phaedrus noticed that the division of Twain's personality fitted the cultural split he'd been talking about. Tom was an Eastern person, with the manners of New Englander, much closer to Europe than the American West, but Huck was a Western person, closer to the Indians, forever restless, unattached, unbelieving in the pompousness of society, wanting more than anything else just to be free. Freedom. That was the topic that would drive home this whole understanding of Indians. Of all the topics his slips on Indians covered, freedom was the most important. Of all the contributions America has made to the history of the world, the idea of freedom from a social hierarchy has been the greatest. It was fought for in the American Revolution and confirmed in the Civil War. To this day, it's still the most powerful, compelling ideal holding the whole nation together. And yet, although Jefferson called this doctrine of social equality self-evident, it's not at all self-evident. Scientific evidence and the social evidence of history indicate the opposite is self-evident. There is no self-evidence in European history that all men are created equal. There's no nation in Europe that doesn't trace its history to a time that it was self-evident that all men are created unequal. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is sometimes given credit for this doctrine, certainly didn't get it from the history of Europe or Asia or Africa. He got it from the impact of the New World upon Europe and from contemplation of one particular kind of individual who lived in the New World. The person was called the noble savage. The idea that all men are created equal is a gift to the world from the American Indian. Europeans who settled here only transmitted it as a doctrine they sometimes followed and sometimes did not. The real source was someone for whom social equality was no mere doctrine, who had equality built into his bones. To him it was inconceivable that the world could be any other way. For him there was no other way of life. That's what 10 Bears was trying to tell them. Phaedrus thought the Indians hadn't yet lost this one. They hadn't yet won it either, he realized. The fight isn't over. It's still the central internal conflict in America today. It's a fault line, a discontinuity that runs through the center of the American cultural personality. It's dominated by American history from the beginning and continues to be a source of both national strength and weakness today. And as Phaedrus's studies got deeper and deeper, he saw that it was to this conflict between European and Indian values, between freedom and order, that his study should be directed.